The office at OmniCore Logistics was once a sanctuary of quiet, unadorned productivity, a place with a hum of high-end server fans, and the rhythmic tapping of mechanical keyboards formed a symphony of efficiency that required no interpretation or sociological deconstruction to be understood as successful. We were a specialized team of data architects and systems engineers, a collective of 30 individuals who had spent years refining a code base so complex it bordered on ascension. And at the very center of this clockwork universe sat Arthur, a man whose presence was defined not by what he said, but by what he quietly ensured never broke. Arthur was the ultimate compliance ghost, a senior developer who had been with the firm for 15 years, possessing a mind that functioned like a high-speed processor and a personality that was as neutral and unobtrusive as the gray acoustic panels on our cubicle walls. He was a man who stayed until midnight to catch a memory leak that no one else could find, the one who navigated the Byzantine architecture of our legacy systems with the ease of a master cartographer, and he did it all without ever raising his voice, seeking credit, or engaging in performative posturing that usually defines corporate ladder climbing. For us, Arthur's silence was a mark of absolute reliability, a signal that the systems were green and the logic was sound. But for Regina, the newly appointed head of cultural alignment and workplace equity, Arthur's quiet competence was not a virtue, but a profound and dangerous manifestation of toxic exclusionary silence. Regina had been brought in by the new board of directors to modernize the human infrastructure of OmniCore, arriving with a briefcase full of radical social theories and a deep-seated suspicion of any environment where men were allowed to work without constant, proactive emotional transparency. She saw our department, a group of men and women who had achieved a perfect, unforced meritocracy, as a den of unexamined patriarchal norms, and she spent her first week patrolling the hallways like an inquisitor, her eyes narrowing every time she passed Arthur's cubicle, where he sat in focused, productive stillness. To Regina, a man who didn't constantly vocalize his support for her specific ideological framework, was a man who was actively, albeit quietly, resisting the new vanguard progress, and she wasted no time in identifying Arthur as the primary obstacle to her vision of a vocalized, equitable workspace. She didn't see the millions of lines of perfect code he produced. She only saw a man who refused to participate in the communal emotional labor she deemed mandatory, and thus, the stage was set for a confrontation between a woman who believed that everything was a power dynamic and a man who simply wanted to do his job in peace. Regina's first major act was the implementation of the Dialogue Equity Mandate, a set of special rules designed specifically to level the linguistic playing field by placing strict, almost impossible constraints on the male employees of the department, with a particular focus on those she categorized as high-output, low-engagement individuals like Arthur. Under this mandate, men were forbidden from initiating any technical discussion without first providing a contextual validation statement that acknowledged the emotional state and creative agency of their female colleagues, and they were strictly prohibited from providing unsolicited technical corrections, even if those corrections were necessary to prevent a total system failure. Regina began a series of tone sensitivity audits, where she would intercept Arthur's perfectly concise, data-driven emails and return them with red pen annotations, claiming that his use of bullet points was assertively masculine, and that his failure to use exclamation points or connective empathy language made his communications feel like a hostile digital cold front. Arthur, true to his nature as a man who solved systems, did not fight these new rules. Instead, he studied them with the same analytical intensity he applied to a failing server, and then he implemented them with a level of precision that was both terrifying and absolute. He became a ghost within a ghost, a man who followed every linguistic quota and every emotional labor requirement to the letter, resulting in a communication style that was so sanitized, so stripped of human character, and so perfectly compliant that it became impossible for Regina to find a legitimate flaw, even as the office's actual productivity began to grind to a halt. In meetings, Arthur would sit for 45 minutes without uttering a syllable, waiting to the mandated 5-second buffer after every woman spoke, and when he finally did contribute, he would recite Regina's validation acknowledgments with the monotone cadence of a captured spy, providing exactly the data requested and nothing more. He stopped offering the just-a-thought fixes that had saved us from 1,000 disasters. He stopped mentoring the juniors who relied on his quiet wisdom, and he stopped caring about the quality of the project entirely, treating Regina's rules as the only code base that mattered. Regina was furious because she couldn't catch him in a lie or a moment of rebellion. She had demanded a world where men were seen and not heard, or heard only in a frequency she controlled, and Arthur had given her exactly that, turning himself into a silent, unmovable pillar of compliance that offered her no friction to push against, no toxic behavior to correct, and no soul to align. The department watched in a state of suspended disbelief as our most valuable asset began to vanish before our eyes, not through resignation or firing, but through the absolute adherence to a set of rules that were designed to break his spirit, but had instead only succeeded in killing his interest in our collective success. By the second week, the atmosphere at OmniCore Logistics had shifted from a sanctuary of productivity into a high-pressure laboratory of sociological experimentation, where the primary objective was no longer the movement of global freight data, but the constant, invasive monitoring of the masculine internal state. Regina, emboldened by the lack of direct resistance from men, introduced her most radical tool yet, the emotional resonance log, a mandatory digital ledger where every male employee was required to record their effective contributions to the workspace every 2 hours, ensuring that their internal vibe was not creating an unseen atmospheric burden for their female colleagues. This log was not merely a survey. It was a weaponized metric of vulnerability, requiring men to articulate their feelings about their own spatial privilege and to document instances where they purposefully receded to allow a woman to occupy more psychological territory. For Arthur, this was simply another system to be mastered, and he approached the task with literalism so profound that it became a form of psychological warfare. He treated his emotions as if they were lines of machine code, entering descriptions of his internal state that were technically perfect but entirely devoid of the radical warmth Regina was trying to extract. His entries became legendary among the rest of us, whispered about in the safety of the parking lot. Timestamp, 10 a.m. Internal state, procedural. Objective, data entry. Mitigation. Ensured physical posture occupied exactly 30% of chair volume to avoid spatial expansionism. Current sentiment, compliant. Regina would summon him to her office, a room decorated with non-linear furniture and a constant, cloying scent of essential oils designed to dissolve masculine rigidity, and lecture him for an hour on how his entries lacked authentic emotional labor. She would sit him on a low, ergonomic stool while she perched above him, trying to force a breakthrough of resentment or anger that she could then categorize as a toxic flare-up. But Arthur would simply sit in perfect, relaxed stillness, his eyes focused on a point just past her shoulder, his breathing steady and slow. He was a master of the non-reactive stance, a technique we all began to emulate, realizing that any spark of personality was merely fuel for Regina's corrective furnace, and as a result, the men of the department began to look like a collection of stone statues, following every rule about eye contact duration and collaborative nodding, with a precision that was both uncanny and utterly frustrating to a woman who thrived on the deconstruction of conflict. Regina began to refer to Arthur's behavior as aggressive neutrality, a term she invented to describe the way his absolute compliance made her feel irrelevant, and she started drafting the toxic attitude memo that would eventually serve as a foundation for his termination, claiming that his refusal to enthusiastically engage with the equity framework was a form of silent sabotage against the sisterhood. The tension finally reached a boiling point during the Vanguard Systems migration, a project that represented the lifeblood of OmniCore's quarterly revenue and required the total synchronization of our entire architectural team. Yet it was here that Regina's special rules finally collided with the uncompromising reality of high-level systems engineering. Elena, a talented but relatively junior developer whom Regina had insisted lead the project to shatter the gatekeeping hierarchy, was struggling with a complex synchronization error that threatened to wipe out 3 years of historical shipping data, an error that Arthur had already identified and solved in his head 48 hours earlier. Under the old regime, Arthur would have quietly walked to Elena's desk, pointed at the errant line of logic, and they would have laughed about the ghost in the machine while fixing it in under 5 minutes. But under Regina's equity protocol, such an act was now classified as intellectual intrusion and competence-based silencing. Rule 7 of the mandate was explicit. Men must allow women to navigate their own technical journeys to avoid the reinforcement of the expert savior masculine trope, a rule Arthur followed with the cold, detached discipline of a monk observing a vow of silence. As the deadline approached and the server logs began to bleed red, Elena looked toward Arthur's cubicle, her eyes pleading for the kind of unsolicited help that had once been the hallmark of their partnership. But Arthur remained motionless, his eyes fixed on a documentation task, his hands moving with mechanical indifference. He was holding space for a failure, exactly as Regina had demanded in her Friday morning resilience workshop. And even as the system began its final, catastrophic shutdown sequence, he did not utter a single word of warning. When the crash finally happened, plunging our primary client's logistics network into total darkness, the silence in the office was so absolute it felt physical, a heavy, suffocating weight that Regina tried to dispel by screaming at the men for their apathetic refusal to support the team. She burst out of her office, her face a mask of panicked self-righteousness, and pointed a trembling finger at Arthur, accusing him of withholding knowledge as a form of patriarchal power play, claiming that his silence was a toxic abandonment of the collective. Arthur simply looked at his watch, waited for the mandatory 5-second buffer after she finished shrieking, and then opened his printed copy of the Dialogue Equity Mandate to page 14, pointing calmly at a rule that forbade men from usurping the creative struggle of female leads. He didn't offend his character. He didn't apologize for the millions of dollars lost. He simply cited the corrective logic she had forced upon him. Leaving Regina standing in the middle of a collapsing department, realized that she had finally succeeded in creating a world where men truly did not care if her world burned to the ground, so long as they were following the rules she had written to govern the ashes. The aftermath of the Vanguard system's failure was not met with an internal technical postmortem or a logical analysis of the cascading errors that led to the collapse. Instead, it ushered in a period of intense ideological scrutiny that Regina branded as the atmospheric cleansing initiative, a process where the blame was shifted entirely away from her restrictive policies and onto the vibrational resistance of the male staff, specifically Arthur. Regina had become obsessed with the idea that Arthur's perfect mechanical compliance was a form of high-level psychological sabotage, arguing in her daily reports to the board that his refusal to provide unsolicited help was a calculated move to gaslight the female creative lead into a state of public inadequacy. She transformed the office into a panopticon of emotional surveillance, spending hours standing behind Arthur's desk with a clipboard, recording the frequency of his sighs, the exact angle of his head during meetings, and the exclusionary nature of his focus, which he claimed created an unspoken frontier hostility that prevented equitable flow. For Arthur, the pressure was merely another set of variables to be integrated into his operational parameters. He began to move through the office with a ghostly, frictionless grace, ensuring that he never occupied more than a third of any hallway, that his eye contact never lasted more than the culturally safe 3 seconds she had mandated, and that his voice never rose above a specific decibel level designed to avoid linguistic intimidation. He was following every microscopic directive she issued, yet this very perfection drove Regina into a state of frantic, self-righteous agitation, because she realized that without his toxicity to correct, her own role as an alignment agent was becoming increasingly difficult to justify to a board that was beginning to notice the sharp decline in shipping efficiency. She decided that if she could not catch him in a technical error, she would prosecute him for his internal state, launching a formal attitudinal alignment review that focused entirely on his failure to provide authentic emotional warmth to collective. She argued that Arthur's quiet nature was a weaponized form of emotional unavailability, a toxic residue of the old guard that acted as a psychological dampener on the newly reclaimed voices of the department. And she prepared a performance improvement plan that required him to attend radical empathy huddles and to actively perform enthusiasm for her sociological theories during his off hours. The men of the department watched this escalation with a growing sense of detached horror, realizing that they were witnessing the final stages of a hunt where the prey was being punished not for what he did, but for the very fact that he refused to be the monster the hunter needed him to be to feel like a hero. Arthur, as always, accepted the PIP with a polite, neutral nod, signing the document that categorizes 15 years of brilliant, quiet service as a systemic burden of exclusionary silence, and he returned to his desk to continue writing the most efficient, flawlessly compliant code OmniCore had ever seen, even as the walls of the company began to crack under the weight of Regina's reconstructive madness. The climax of the sociological crusade arrived on a cold Thursday morning when Regina summoned Arthur to the sanctuary room, a conference area she had stripped of tables to remove the literal and figurative barriers of patriarchal negotiation for what she termed a final calibration meeting, though we all knew it was a setting for a public execution of character. She sat on a floor cushion, surrounded by equity facilitators who were there to document the resonance, while Arthur was directed to sit on a low, backless stool in the center of the room, a position clearly designed to make him feel physically and psychologically subservient to her vantage point. Regina spent 40 minutes reading from a 100-page dossier she had compiled, a document that listed microatmospheric transgressions, such as failure to use affirmative emojis in internal Slack channels, occupying a sitting posture that suggested intellectual self-sufficiency, and maintaining a silence that felt inherently judgmental to the creative agency of others. She accused him of toxic indifference, claiming that his refusal to argue with her, his refusal to plead for his job, and his absolute adherence to her impossible rules were the ultimate forms of patriarchal spite, and she declared that his presence had become a non-negotiable safety risk to the emotional health of the sisterhood. The department stood outside the glass walls, a silent crowd of developers and analysts who had spent years relying on Arthur's quiet strength, watching as Regina reached a crescendo of her rhetoric, her voice trembling with the thrill of purging the old world, as she informed him that his employment was being terminated effective immediately for a toxic attitude and systemic failure to align with the equitable mission. Arthur did not flinch. He did not look for support from the crowd outside, nor did he allow even a flicker of resentment to touch his face, instead waiting through the mandatory 5-second silence Regina had once defined as the threshold of respectful closure before he spoke. "I value the feedback you provided regarding my attitudinal output, Regina," he said, his voice as steady and neutral as a dial tone. "And I recognize that in an environment where enthusiastic engagement is a technical requirement, my baseline of quiet compliance is indeed a failure of the system's new logic. I will vacate the premises within a mandated 30-minute window to avoid any further spatial colonization of this sanctuary." He stood up, bowed slightly to facilitators, and walked out of the room with the calm, purposeful stride of a man who had finally solved an unsolvable problem, leaving Regina sitting on her cushion in a state of sudden, inexplicable shock. She had expected a fight. She had expected a toxic outburst she could record and show to the board as proof of her necessity, but instead, she had been met with a level of graceful, absolute compliance that left her with nothing but a silent room in the growing, terrifying realization that she had just removed the only person who knew how to keep the company's heart beating. As Arthur packed his single box and walked toward the elevator, the rest of the department didn't return to their desks. They didn't log into their terminals or resume their emotional resonance logs, instead standing in the hallways with their coats on and their laptops closed, a silent, collective wall of indifference that Regina found far more frightening than any shout or protest could have ever been. The moment the elevator door slid shut with a final metallic click, severing Arthur's 15-year history with OmniCore logistics, a strange and terrifying transformation began to ripple through the office, a phenomenon that Regina initially misinterpreted as the reverent silence of a newly liberated collective. She stood in the center of the sanctuary room, her face flushed with the adrenaline of what she believed was a historic victory over a dormant patriarchal force, and she began to deliver a victory speech saturated with terms like harmonic recalibration and the dawn of the vocalized era, seemingly oblivious to the fact that every person in the room, male and female alike, was staring at her with the hollow, unfocused gaze of people who had just watched a vital engine part be thrown into a furnace. Regina attempted to rally the department, her voice echoing in a space that had suddenly become an acoustic vacuum, urging the newly centered voices to seize the creative territory Arthur had supposedly colonized. But as she moved from one group to the other, trying to spark the vibrant emotional engagement she had promised the board, she was met with a wall of absolute, chillingly perfect compliance. The men, who had once been the quiet backbone of the architectural team, were no longer just following the rules. They had become biological mirrors of the dialogue equity mandate, standing with their hands folded, their eyes fixed on the oatmeal-colored carpet, refusing to initiate any form of communication that wasn't a direct, monotone response to a technical inquiry. Every time Regina tried to engage one of them in a vulnerability check, they would wait to the mandatory 5-second buffer, provide a validation acknowledgement that was so grammatically flawless and emotionally empty it felt like a software error, and then return to their state of motionless observation. The office, which had once been a place of unforced collaboration, was now a museum of static bodies, a place where the linguistic quotas, were being followed with such religious intensity that it became impossible for any work to actually occur. Regina's triumph began to sour within the first hour as she realized that she had not sparked a revolution, but a total systemic shutdown. She had removed the toxic element she believed was suppressing the team's energy, only to find that the energy itself had vanished along with the man who had quietly facilitated its flow. The air in the office grew stagnant, heavy with the weight of 30 people who were all simultaneously practicing maximum spatial deference, leaving Regina as the only moving part of the machine that had collectively decided to stop turning, a queen of a silent kingdom who was beginning to realize that you cannot lead a population that has decided to become invisible. By noon, the silent walkout began, though it did not look like a traditional strike or a disorganized protest. It looked like the final, logical step in the equity protocol that Regina herself had authored and enforced with such ideological fervor. It started with Sarah, the lead account manager who had once been Regina's most vocal supporter, but who had spent the last week watching her career and her sanity crumble under the weight of rules that prioritized vibrational resonance over the actual delivery of freight data. Sarah stood up from her desk, her movements slow and deliberate, and began to pack her laptop into her bag, an act that immediately drew Regina's attention like a flare in the dark. Regina rushed over, her face a mask of panic concern, and asked Sarah if she was experiencing an internalized patriarchal trigger or she needed to hold space for a personal wellness recalibration, her jargon-heavy voice rising in pitch as she sensed the first cracks in the department's compliance. Sarah didn't look at her. Instead, she waited to the 5-second buffer, her eyes fixed on the empty coffee pot, and then spoke in a voice that was eerily similar to Arthur's, flat, measured, and entirely devoid of the radical warmth Regina craved. "I value the inquiry you have brought to my workspace, Regina," Sarah said, reciting the mandatory script with a haunting, robotic accuracy, "and I recognize that in this newly centered environment, my continued presence while in a state of technical exhaustion could be seen as an imposition of my own creative fatigue on the collective. I am therefore receding from this space to avoid any further atmospheric clogging of the equitable mission." Before Regina could respond with a deconstruction of Sarah's affective state, another developer stood up, then another, then a junior analyst, all of them moving with a quiet, synchronized grace that felt like a pre-programmed exit sequence. The men followed suit, each of them wading through their mandated buffers, providing their validation acknowledgments for the closure of the technical cycle, and leaving their terminals at the exact moment the clock struck 12, an exodus of the measured minds that left the office sounding only like the hum of the air conditioning. Regina stood in the middle of the cubicle farm, her hands trembling as she grabbed her clipboard, screaming at them to stay in their lanes and to respect the hierarchy of the mission. But the department didn't argue, they didn't shout back, and they didn't offer her the toxic conflict she needed to reassert her authority. They simply walked toward the elevators in a single, silent line, a collection of compliance ghosts who were finally exercising their right to recede so completely that they were vacating the company itself, leaving Regina alone with the red error lights of the server room and the deafening, unignorable sound of a system that had been aligned into total and utter non-existence. The silence that occupied the office of OmniCore Logistics in the wake of the mass walkout was not the peaceful, decolonized stillness Regina had envisioned in her theoretical manifestos, but rather the heavy, suffocating silence of a graveyard where the only thing left to witness the decay was a flickering red light of a dozen failing server racks. Regina stood in the center of the open plan floor, clutching her clipboard to her chest like a shield, her eyes darting from one abandoned cubicle to another, searching for some sign that this was merely another calibration exercise or a stage vulnerability test designed to gauge her leadership during a systemic crisis. The air was thick with the smell of ozone from the overheating hardware in the back room, a room that only Arthur and his senior architects had the keys and the specialized knowledge to navigate. And as the minutes ticked past the noon hour, the mechanical hum of the building seemed to grow louder, as if the physical infrastructure itself was screaming in the absence of men who had spent 15 years whispering it into submission. Regina began to pace the oatmeal-colored carpet, her heels clicking in a frantic, uneven rhythm that betrayed her growing desperation, and she found herself stopping in front of Arthur's empty desk, staring at the single, perfectly centered sticky note he had left behind, which contained nothing but a series of login credentials for the emergency shutdown sequence that no one in the room knew how to execute. To her left, the linguistic quota. Posters looked like mocking tombstones in the dimming light. their bright colors and optimistic slogans about reclaiming the voice now seeming like cruel jokes in a space where every voice had simultaneously decided that the most powerful thing could do was to never speak to her again. She tried to open her laptop to send an emergency resonance alert to the board of directors, but her hands were shaking so violently that she couldn't even type her password, and as the first of the primary shipping databases began to go offline, triggering a cascade of critical failure sirens that echoed to the empty hallways, Regina realized that she had finally achieved her ultimate goal. She was the only one left with any space, any voice, and any creative agency, and it was precisely that absolute power that was currently strangling her career to death. The irony was a physical weight, a crushing realization that by purging the toxic quietude of Arthur and the measured indifference of his team, she had removed the very dampeners that prevented the company from vibrating itself into dust, leaving her as a captain of a sinking ship who had spent the entire voyage trying to fire the engine room staff for being too mechanically focused. She sat down on the floor, not on one of her ergonomic cushions, but on the hard, cold floor, and waited for the sound of the elevators, hoping against hope that someone would return to provide the conflict, the resistance, or the toxic friction she needed to feel relevant. But the only sound that greeted her was a relentless, rhythmic beep of a system that was dying exactly as she had ordered it to, in a state of perfect, uninterrupted, and entirely equitable silence. The arrival of Mr. Sterling and the board of directors at 2 p.m. was not preceded by a contextual validation statement or a buffer of respectful entry, but by the brutal, unceremonious crash of the double glass doors and the smell of expensive tobacco and impending litigation. Sterling, a man whose presence was defined by a lifetime of making decisions based on spreadsheets rather than vibrational resonance, walked on the floor and stopped dead, his eyes scanning the empty desks and read, screaming error monitors with a look of such profound, cold fury that Regina felt the air leave her lungs in a single, ragged gasp. He didn't look at the posters about spatial colonization, and he didn't acknowledge the sanctuary room layout. He walked straight to the server room door, saw the locked, unauthorized entry light, a light that only Arthur's biometric signature could change, and then turned to Regina with the slow, terrifying deliberation of a predator that had finally found the source of his hunger. "Regina," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate the very glass walls she had spent weeks polishing with her jargon. "I spent the last 2 hours on the phone with the Port of Los Angeles, the Federal Department of Transportation, and 3 of our largest international shipping partners, all of whom are currently informing me that OmniCore Logistics has effectively vanished from the global grid." Regina tried to stand, her asymmetrical linen suit looking crumpled and pathetic in the presence of his tailored charcoal wool, and she began to stammer out a defense about cultural alignment and the necessary purge of toxic exclusionary silence. But Sterling raised a single hand, and the weight of his silence was far heavier than any rule she had ever written. "I don't care about the internal state of the office, and I certainly don't care about your equity protocols or your linguistic quotas," Sterling interrupted, his eyes boring into her with a level of clarity that made her entire worldview feel like a house of cards. "I care about the fact that I hired a culture rep to fix a few HR complaints, and in 3 weeks, you managed to drive out 30 people, men and women who represent 300 years of collective technical expertise, because you were more offended by their quietness than you were interested in their productivity." He walked over to Arthur's desk, picked up the emergency shutdown note, and looked at it for a long moment before dropping it onto the floor, where it landed on top of Regina's emotional resonance log. "You fired Arthur for a toxic attitude, because he followed your rules too perfectly, Regina, and in doing so, you proved to the entire department that excellence is a liability in your kingdom. They didn't walk out because they were angry. They walked out because they realized that you are a virus that consumes the very hosts that keep you alive." He leaned in close, his voice dropping into a whisper that felt like a death sentence. "The board has already met. Your termination is an alignment check or a vantage point adjustment. It is an eviction. You have 10 minutes to take your cushions and your clipboards and vacate this property. And if you ever attempt to list OmniCore as a reference, I will personally ensure that every logistical firm from here to Singapore knows that you are the woman who broke the world's most efficient shipping firm because you couldn't stand the sound of men working in silence." Sterling didn't wait for her to respond. He didn't offer her a closure huddle or a vulnerability window. He simply turned his back on her and began dialing a number on his phone. Arthur's number, leaving Regina alone in the ruins of her experiment, a woman who had tried to teach the world a lesson and had ended up being the only one left to repeat the grade. The final chapter of OmniCore Logistics didn't end with a return to the gray sanctuary, but with the birth of something entirely new and far more formidable, a firm that the industry quickly began to call the Silent Engine, founded by Arthur and the 29 men and women who had walked out of the office that Friday morning. They didn't need a head of cultural alignment, and they certainly didn't need a dialogue equity mandate. They built a workspace where the only protocol was a code, and the only vantage point that mattered was the one that led to a successful deployment. In the new firm, men and women worked side by side in a state of unforced organic collaboration, interrupting each other when a logic gate was failing, providing unsolicited technical corrections that saved millions, and communicating in a shorthand that was as efficient as it was loud, messy, and human. Arthur remained the quiet center of the storm, but now his silence was respected as a sign of deep focus rather than a toxic exclusion, and the team realized that the most powerful form of equity was simply the freedom to do one's job without being scrutinized to the vibrational resonance of their breathing. Back at the old OmniCore, Sterling managed to beg Arthur to come back as a consultant just long enough to unlock the servers, pay him a fee that was 3 times his previous annual salary for 2 hours of work, a final irony that Arthur accepted with his signature neutral nod and a perfectly compliant "thank you for the opportunity." Regina, meanwhile, disappeared into the world of academic consulting, where she continued to write papers about the Great Quiet as a success story of feminist resistance, framing the destruction of a $50 million company as a necessary sacrifice to expose the fragility of the masculine ego. She never realized that the men hadn't been broken by her rules. They had been liberated by them, freed from the burden of caring about a system that didn't value their contribution, and allowed to find a place where their silence was seen as a tool rather than a weapon. The story of the OmniCore walkout became a legend in the tech industry, a cautionary tale for any leader who thinks they can engineer a culture by silencing the very people who build it, and a reminder that the most dangerous employee in any company isn't the one who is loud and angry, but the one who is quiet, competent, and finally, completely indifferent to whether you succeed or fail. Arthur still keeps his equity journal in a drawer in his new office, not as a tool for self-reflection, but as a reminder of the time he was fired for being too good at following the rules. And every time he looks at it, he smiles, a real, genuine, and entirely non-compliant smile, before it turned to quiet, brilliant work of building a world that doesn't need to be aligned to be perfect. The department remains a cohesive unit, a wall of people who learn that the ultimate response to a leader who wants to control your spirit isn't to fight the rules, but to follow them until the leader realizes that they're the only ones left in the prison they built. And as for the toxic attitude Regina was so desperate to purge, it turns out it was never there at all. It was just the sound of a machine running so perfectly that the person in charge couldn't stand the thought that they weren't the one making